Sander and Brinke, excited to be here. Data API builder fixes a thing called boring APIs. Let's begin. So, my name is Sander and Brinke. This is a great start. I'm a senior software engineer at Arcadie, which is a consultancy company based in Zwolle here in the Netherlands. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP. I do a lot of blogging, speaking, podcasting, stuff like that. And yeah, I work a lot with .NET. I work a lot with Azure. I think a lot of us here do. But as you can see, I'm also very interested in working with a lot of other stuff, except for CSS. And yeah, let's begin. So the agenda. First, we're going to talk about building boring APIs. It's a bit vague. What do I mean? Building boring APIs. What do I mean with this? We're here. We've arrived. So what I mean with building a boring API is basically your average data API. And what is a data API? Well, to me, let's say we're building a simple client, or maybe a very complex client that does a lot of stuff, but it mostly just needs an API to interact with a database, right? It needs to retrieve data, it needs to insert data, it needs to maybe edit a little bit, but it doesn't do a lot more. Maybe 1, 2 custom things. But for the rest, the API is kind of more like a wrapper around the database itself, because we never want to write raw SQL in our client, because it's very dangerous. So the API does things like authentication, authorization, and those kind of things. And maybe we do this with REST endpoints, we do this with GraphQL endpoints. In the end, the API is simply a wrapper around the database, and it has some REST endpoints, some GraphQL endpoints to work with. So common examples, maybe like a workout app that we're creating, right? So we want to track our workouts, a simple inventory management system for like a small company, a customer support ticketing system, maybe all these to-do apps that we always create. These just need a simple API to insert some data and not much else, a data API. So why is this bad? Well, it's not really bad, it depends. But to me, to build an API, just a simple data API, we need to do a whole lot of things, right? We need to create a repository, we need to set up the folder structure, basic documentation, we need to choose the framework or the language of the week, set up project skeletons, an architecture of the week, and now we get a JSON file, which we're going to talk about later. And now with the CLI, we can say dab add book, so we want to expose a new entity called book. For the source, DBO books, so the books table, and the permissions in this case are anonymous star. So you don't need to be logged in to do everything. Of course, for a demo, you're not going to really do this in real applications. But for example, you could imagine here to be authenticated or custom roles like librarian, admin, customer support. And then the star could be like create, read, update, delete. So this is how you can really configure what a user is allowed to do in your data API. You run dab start. And then you will see that within like a second or something, it will have an endpoint launched. And you can go ahead and do localhost 5001, API books. And this will go and give you back all the books. It will connect to the database for you. Instead of having to write all of that custom code that we talked about before, we're done. I find this to be fascinating. I find it to be very useful for simple APIs to start using something like this. And I said, we're not building it, we're configuring it. So how does that work? The configuration file for DAB is a JSON schema file, so you have really nice IntelliSense, you have really nice, in the editor you have a really good experience of autocomplete and stuff like that. And first we have the data source property or object, which is how should DAB connect to your data source. So here you specify the database type, here you specify the connection string, some specific database connection options, and that is already enough to kind of connect to your database. Next, there's also data source files. We're not going to talk a lot about this. But that is basically a way for DAB to connect to multiple sources, which is really cool. We could, for example, already be in a system or like in an environment where we have a Postgres database here, a MySQL database there, and an Azure SQL thing there. Instead of having to set up multiple DAB instances, we can connect DAB to multiple sources. So we could expose books from API/books, which is grabbed from MySQL. We could get customers from Postgres. Yeah, it's a pretty good way to kind of set up one thing with multiple systems. Runtime options, caching, REST options, GraphQL options, host options, telemetry options. There's a lot, which I find just great. Because it means that this is, again, an application that I can make suit my needs instead of having to conform to what they want me to do. Entities is the final one. This is the one that you're going to be touching the most. Here you can expose your entities. So by default, when you create a DAB application, nothing is exposed. When we're telling it to dab add book, it will only expose the books from our database. And of course, in a secure way, because of authentication. And we can also even say we only want specific actions. So for example, you can only There's not even a way to delete books. Like we can only say that we want to create endpoint exposed, for example. Then there's relationships. So we can say, well, a book it has a relationship to an author, which is very useful for GraphQL later on. There's permissions for like the built-in roles, custom roles. So we can really define what users are allowed to do. And there's mappings. So we can, for example, say a column in our database book number should be exposed in our API as book ID. So let's have a look at a simple entity. So this is a part of the JSON file. This is what we could have had configured when we ran dab add book. And it's completely fine if you don't want to use the CLI, you just want to use this or whatever you want. So here we have a book entity with a source, which is the DBO books table. GraphQL is enabled for this entity, so you can either enable or disable GraphQL globally or even like for specific entities. We have types, which is useful for relationships. You'll see that later. There's REST is enabled, so we can get our, like just your normal REST endpoints. And there's the permissions again that we saw. So we can configure it, but can we use it? What are the usage options? What do they look like? I like it. I'm pretty happy. So there's REST endpoints by default to, for example, get our books, create a new book. We can get a specific book. We can put a specific book, delete, etc. This is the stuff we always build ourselves. Next, there's GraphQL. So are there any people here not familiar with GraphQL? Yeah, well, I'll go over it quickly. So normally when we build our APIs, the server kind of determines what we are returning. So we, for example, returning a book, that is always an ID, a title, and a number of pages. And then the client says, yeah, but I also would like the author information. So then we either need to make our REST endpoint bigger and return more data, or the client needs to do more requests to fetch all the data themselves. So with GraphQL, you can kind of let the client determine all of that. So we can say here, the client executes a query when he wants all the books, and he wants the ID and the title from all the books. And if a book has a relationship to an author, you can now also retrieve the authors from the server. So the client is in full control of what data they want to return. This has upsides and downsides. Let's not go into those. But it is possible. It makes for, because we're simply creating a data API, the client being very powerful is a good thing. And that is definitely the case with GraphQL. Finally, there's OData, which is kind of very popular with Microsoft. And it's basically a standard to implement very common API operations. You get those out of the box. So we can say $select, which means I only want these properties, kind of comparable to GraphQL. So we want all the books, but only the ID and the title of all the books. You can also have a filter, which allows you to kind of write like where statements, like I only want ID where that is higher than 20. I only want books with the title containing The Lord of the Rings, first book in my mind, and order by, first, after, paging, sorting, stuff like this. So all of this is already implemented for you. I remember having to implement this in my ASP.NET Core applications. Forget about it, it's done. So I think this is a really good experience as a client. We can do a whole lot of things. So let's talk about relationship next. This is GraphQL only, and dab supports 3 versions. One to many, many to one, many to many. And what we, for example, then want to do with this rich GraphQL experience is we want to be able to say, I want to write a query that returns all the book series, but only the name of that series, not the ID or something, just the name, but also all the books that belong to that series and only the title of that. It's quite complex, but not for dab. Dab update series, I want to create a new relationship called books, target the entity book as the other side of the relationship, and make it a cardinality of many. So a series has many books. This works because your database is probably also configured to have foreign keys, and now this query will just work. And it will result in the following JSON, where we have a series entity with a relationship called books, with a target entity book and a cardinality many. That's all there is to it. And now we can write really cool GraphQL queries and have a really rich client experience. In the next slide, I want to kind of go into a demo. But first, I want to kind of summarize what I've talked about you so far and make sure everything clicks. So a little bit of an architecture overview. With dab, we have 2 inputs, a configuration file in JSON and a relational schema or a GraphQL schema in case we're using something like Cosmos DB with NoSQL. This is all kind of parsed at runtime, and then it will generate an API for you, and it will run it. And then the endpoints, the things you get as output are REST endpoints and GraphQL endpoints. It's not that complex, but it's really useful. So the demo, what I'm going to talk to you about, this entire kind of talk here is going to be demoing a lot about books and authors. In this case, we have a series which has many books. Books can have many authors. And a book's author also has a link to an author type. So a book can have many authors, one of them being the main author, contributor, stuff like this. There's also a couple of database views and stored procedures. So let's take a look at this demo. There we go. Let me share my screen. All right, let me know in the back if that's big enough. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so this is Swagger UI. Is someone here not familiar with Swagger UI? Okay, sure. So when you are using something like OpenAPI, which is this document, which is auto-generated for you, it's basically a description of your API in like a standard language. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to do a lot of things like generating API clients, security checks, validation checks, but it also allows you to generate documentation based on your API, which is what you get out of the box here. So what you see here is a list of all of the endpoints that the DAB now has exposed for me based on this database that I've configured. So we have endpoints to retrieve all the series, all the books, authors, book authors, which is that linking table, author types. This is like a view, and this is a stored procedure. And that's great. So let's do a little demo. So here I kind of say, I want to get all the books. Let's go and do it. Now we get all the books. So we get like, there we go. I can't really do this now. There you go. So we get like the book, Prelude to Foundation. Actually, I've never heard of that one. Anyway, you can see all the books here. And we could with OData say, well, I don't really want all of that data. I just want the title. And this is just basically that fancy UI, Swagger, that just turns this into a request to our server. So you can here see the curl. This will generate a request. And now you can see that it only returned the title. So it's really nice, a really nice playground for your API. To prove to you that it's not a fluke, here's my database. And here you can also see all of my books in the database. A couple of normal books, I think some fantasy, sci-fi books, a couple of Azure SQL books. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new book series. So I've recently been reading the Red Rising series from Pierce Brown. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy some of this stuff I've prepared. So I want to create a new book series, and that's going to be done. Next, I also want to, of course, create an author. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new author. Let's go copy this, which is now done. And to also prove to you the GraphQL thing, which is, I think, really fancy. Look at that. We can now also do the rest with GraphQL. So we have a mutation here. First, we had a query that's read. And this mutation means like, well, mutate, edit, create, delete, stuff like this. So we want to create a book called Red Rising. I really recommend it. It's written in 2014. It's like a dystopian sci-fi science fiction novel. And we can create this. Please work. Yes. Great. You can see that the series ID I'd already filled in for us. And we can also create the create book author, which will create the link between the book and the author, which is now also done, as we can see here on the right. And that's really all there's to it. So let's execute one of our views, which is author book count. So you can kind of see this maybe as like a custom function. You could create like views and stored procedures in your database. And these could kind of be custom functions you could be executing. So if you want to do something really fancy with your data, you could do that here. You could even, but we as developers don't really like that, could make use of like the invoke REST endpoint in Azure SQL, that you could actually call REST endpoints in SQL queries to do really crazy things. I'm not a big fan of it. I told that to the Azure SQL team, and everyone kind of booed at me because they loved it. But it's your choice. So here we can take a look, and we see that the new author, Pierce Brown, has written one book in this case. OK, so that's kind of the demo. It's just an API, right? But we only had to do DAB start and some configuration. So here we have our configuration file. And this extension that I'm using here is called Code Tour. It's really nice. It allows you to like kind of create a tour throughout your code base. So if someone's like, you're onboarding someone on your team, you have a difficult code base, you can create like tours with steps. So you can kind of tell someone, hey, to add a new feature, you need to do these steps. Or in this case, I'm going to tour you to the demo. So here we can see at the beginning of this big JSON file, we can see the schema reference. So we, for example, could say we want to move this database type. And now we can get database type, and then we can also see the suggestions. There we go. And there's loads of extra options. So here's the data source, like I already mentioned. There's the runtime and the caching option. So currently I have caching enabled in memory, time to live 10 seconds. That's all you need to do. And now you have a bit more performance in case you get under heavy load. The REST and GraphQL options globally, so they're both enabled in a global level. There's some extra options that you can enable. The host options, so like the mode, development, production, course, kind of stuff that you want to enable or disable. And of course here, let's take a look at maybe one entity, maybe two. So here we have the series entity again. So we have the series entity, which has a source, DBO series. You can see the permission, so anyone is allowed to do everything. That's also why my demo worked. I didn't log in. And you can see that it has a relationship to the book. There we go. Let me show you a bit more of an advanced one. Now, for example, here. So the book entity has a relationship to the authors. And because these fields might be called differently, you can also explicitly even specify the fields. So there's lots of configuration options here. And I think that's about it that I can show you for now. Are there any questions so far? Yes, please. Yes, maybe let's take a look. Let's see what time we have. That's a great question. That's a great question. Let's afterwards have a look together. I would assume so. I would assume that it works based on your database, like columns and stuff. You know, like the rules you've defined there. Sorry. So the question here is there any validation support? And I'm not really sure. I would assume so. And then the second question is, though, does it maybe work with like fluent validation or like data annotations? So that's not really possible. We're not writing an API. We're just like giving it a configuration file in a database and it just runs. So we can't really do that kind of stuff. But it's a great question. Let's afterwards take a look. Because I haven't even thought about it, but it makes a lot of sense to have that validation. Next question, yeah?
Sorry. So can my database doesn't to let's say books needs to be my database. Can I do this and map it?
To one entity. Ooh, that's a complex case. So the question is, if I have, for example, a book table split up into like 3 tables, but I want to expose it as a single entity, I'm not sure if that's supported. There's quite a lot of complex configuration that I'm just not going to talk about today. It might be supported. At the other hand, maybe not, because it's really just meant as like a view on your database. But it would be a really good idea. So it is open source, and they're definitely looking for new features. So that is definitely something we could suggest later on. Make a GitHub issue. It's a really good idea, if it's not supported already. Any other questions? Last one.
Versioning? Can you do a new version of the?
No. If you change your database model, I don't think there's any versionings built in. But again, a really great idea. It's currently open source. They're currently really building new features. So that's definitely something that we can suggest. All the way in the back. That is true. Yeah.
Dus in plaats van de vrije tekst.
That's a good point. Yeah, you mean the fact that they, for example, have this ID/ID? I have the same reaction. I was like, why? Why do you do the ID/ID? I believe the reason is because you could maybe start querying using a different column. And maybe for the REST endpoint builder, it needs that. I'm not really sure. I haven't researched it. I hope to not get that question because I find this very ugly. But at the other hand, I'm also kind of willing to forgive it because it's just a lot of work done for me. But I think it's a really good criticism. Yeah.
The other thing is, why do you need to specify the relationship, the mapping while you already have
it in your database? So the question is, why do I need to specify relationships in DAB when they are already configured in the database? Simple answer is because they might not be configured in the database. There's options to use different columns to connect to relationships in case your database in case you haven't configured foreign keys or something like this, or you want to create relationships in a different way than your database is currently configured. So it just gives you a bit more freedom, but you also need to do a little bit more configuration. So it's kind of a trade-off that they've made. Yeah, one more. Yep, we're going to talk about that in a bit. I saw some more hands. I just want to quickly move on. I want to save some more time at the end for more questions, and otherwise, well, come to me after the presentation or anywhere else or online. We'll see. We're going to try to handle all the questions. Okay, so let's move on to the next bit. I've shown you everything. What if I want to run custom code? I want to go through a couple of scenarios where you're like, huh, this looks neat. But what if I want to run custom code? But what if I want to do this or that? Currently, Data API Builder does not support that you extend it with custom functions. Would be great. I asked about it. They said that they were thinking about adding something like this, but currently it does not support it. So for example, imagine a scenario where we use DAB and it works great, but then someone says, yeah, but we need to go and talk to an external server to validate some stuff before we put it in our database. What I recommend, and what the DAB team also recommends, is that you could, for example, put API management or a reverse proxy in front of it. And now what you can say is from like 99% of cases, API management will just route your call to Data API Builder to retrieve books, retrieve authors, maybe create a new author. But in case when you're calling to create a new book, you can call an Azure function, which is a serverless function, which is, you can simply upload a function like C#, JavaScript, Python, and an Azure function will just run it for you. You don't need to worry about the runtime or about whatever. It will just execute that code for you. So imagine a bit of code that takes in an HTTP request, does a call to an external server, and inserts the book into the database. Yes, we're writing custom code again, which we wanted to solve with Data API Builder. But for 99% of cases, we can just follow the happy path. For the 1% case, we write a little bit of an Azure function, like 5 lines of code, something like this, and we insert it into the database. I still think that this is a great solution. So what if I want to deal with events? Loads of people and loads of talks currently about eventing and like event storming, event sourcing. This also, I think this is a really neat solution. So API management is not even really needed. Like you can definitely expose the API Builder to the internet. So let's say that the user creates a book and it's inserted into the database. But we also want to send an email to someone that this happened. We could go with the previous path and write all of that ourselves. We could also say, when the book is added to the database, we want to run an Azure function and be based on a SQL trigger. So that means when a new row is added to a database, a function in our Azure environment is called, and we'll simply send that email. This makes also for a very nice experience, where we only need to write a tiny bit of custom code that DAB cannot currently do for us, but like everything else is already just done for us. I just want to say here, I use a lot of Azure logos. I use a lot of like Azure function logos here, like SQL logos. This is not Azure only. This can also run on AWS Lambdas. This can run on Google's version. So just so you know, I want to hammer that down. And what if I want to secure my application? There was a question about this, I think, from you. Oh, about authentication. I'm not sure if that was you. I hope I'm not pointing to the wrong person. OK, just checking. What if I want to secure my application? So the advice is, if you're using API management already, maybe just handle it there. It's easy. You're already doing it there, so then you don't really need to worry about configuring it in DAB. If you want to configure it in DAB, there's a lot of options. So first, we can connect Data API Builder to Easy Auth, which is Azure App Servers and Azure Static Web Apps authentication. Ooh, that's a great question. I'm not sure. I can't answer that right now. Sorry. We could have a look later if you want. I think you were first. Yeah.
Can we also control the caching data for the DAB API?
Say again, sorry?
Can we also control the caching?
Yeah. So can you control the caching? Yes. So what you, I think, currently can do is you can currently use in-memory caching. So you can simply say the time to live. You can do that globally or on an entity-specific basis. But they're using Fusion Cache under the hood. So they're also thinking of like leveraging that more and then also being able to use Redis and distributed caching and all that kind of stuff. So that is all coming. Currently, it's just in-memory. Exactly. Yeah, that's perfectly supported. So that is the item security, where you can simply say based on the role, you can grab the stuff from the token in this kind of policy you're writing, and you can insert that kind of into that policy that you're writing to the database. You could say where user ID is token.userid, and that should work.
Does it already get that out of my existing policies, or do we need to rewrite them in the...
You need to rewrite them in DAB, in the configuration file, yeah. Any more? Yeah.
Is there some generated code for you which you can hack or use or whatever?
So if we're talking about generated code, you can export the GraphQL schema. I don't think that's really what you mean, though. I think you're talking about, I want to see the source code that it actually generates. It's not really generating code. It is literally like looking at, I guess, it's literally just kind of generating or bootstrapping an ASP.NET Core application based on your configuration. So I'm not sure that it's actually writing code and executing it, more than maybe modifying the ASP.NET Core host. There's no, well, to answer your question simpler, no. You can currently not do that. Any more? Great. So I have some stickers here in front if you really like to. If you have more questions later on, let me know. And thank you so much for this full room. It was so much fun. And have a great day.